Hello, everyone. So, one of the hardest New Year's resolutions to fulfill, in my opinion, is trying to read through the Bible cover to cover in a year. How many of you guys have tried that before? Any of you? Okay, wow, a lot of hands. So you've tried that. Here's why it's hard, and I know you guys know this is hard. You start in January, and it's great. You're reading Genesis, and it's like creation and Abraham and all the patriarchs and all these really cool stories, and it's great. And then you get into Exodus, and it's like, oh, wow, the Egyptians and the plagues and Moses and crossing the Red Sea. And then you're into February a little bit, and what do you start reading? The law. The law. You crack open the law, and it's like, and the robe shall be of a length 3 cubits, and you must present your skin disease to the priest, and the grain offering must not contain yeast, and pull the pin on the holy hand grenade and count to 3, and it's the dead of winter, you're freezing cold, you haven't seen the sun in like weeks, and you're stuck reading the law. It's so boring. And hold on. What is the deal with all the oxen? All the oxen. You've read the law, you see what I'm talking about. There are so many laws in the Old Testament about oxen. Like literally, there's a law about what to do if an ox falls into a hole in the ground and what to do in that situation. There's a law about what to do if somebody kills your ox, or what to do if somebody steals your ox, or literally, what to do if an ox gores somebody. That's an important one. Or what to do is another law about what to do if an ox gores a slave. Or another law about what to do if an ox gores a child. And I'm not making this up. There is a law, a specific law in the Old Testament about what to do if an ox gores somebody, but it already had a reputation for goring somebody and you didn't tie it up properly. Like, I'm not joking. Those are all in there. What is the deal with all these oxen? I mean, seriously, was this like an entirely ox-based economy? Right, they're majestic creatures, don't get me wrong, they're beautiful, but this seems like a lot of ox laws. It seems like an awful lot of ox laws. No wonder so many New Year's resolutions fail. And yet, guess what today's topic is for BYOB? It's the law. We're talking about the law. So you know what? It's probably fine to call today Bring Your Own Blanket, because it's probably time for a nap or something, right? The law. Well, hold on. Don't fall asleep just yet, okay? Promise me you're not going to fall asleep. You'll stay awake for just a few more minutes, because I believe, I really do, that most of our distaste for the law comes from the fact that we honestly don't actually understand what it is, and we don't understand why it's important. So I think, hopefully, if today we can clear that up, if we can start to understand what it is and why it's important, then perhaps, you will start to find the law a little bit more interesting. Now, I'm not going to say that you're going to start reading the law when you go to the beach or something like that. Like, that's not how interesting it'll be. It'll probably still be a little bit boring, but I do believe that there is some genuinely life-changing stuff in there. And I want you to be able to find that. So maybe, I'm going to set the bar really low. Maybe today I'll be happy if we can get to the end and you will be able to start reading the law without banging your head against the wall, okay? Does that sound like a decent goal to shoot for? All right, we'll set the bar real low. So the law, what is it? Because that's a huge question that we've got to ask. What is the law? And to answer that question, what we have to do is we have to start by understanding how and why it came into being in the first place. That's how we're going to understand what it is. So I want you to use your imagination. I want you to think back and imagine the Israelites in the wilderness. Okay, if we look at the story of the Old Testament, the Israelites were in Egypt. They were slaves in Egypt. They were freed, they crossed the Red Sea, and they were making their way to the Promised Land. The Promised Land, which was the land of their ancestors. They were making their way over there, but to get there, they had to go through the wilderness, the desert. It was very, they were scary, very wildernessy, I guess. I don't know what the word. I apologize to those who are doing Spanish translation, trying to do wildernessy as a word. So, okay, the Israelites, they're in the desert, they're wandering through the wilderness, and frankly, they didn't have any power. They didn't have any land to call their own. And this God that they were following, Yahweh, this God was a little bit mysterious, right? This was a little bit of a weird, strange time. And so the elders and the religious leaders of Israel, they understood that they had to help the Israelites know what their identity was and what the identity was of their God. So this is why Moses and the Israelite leaders, they began to write what we call the Torah, the first 5 books of our Bible, the Torah. These books are a collection of stories and laws and poems and speeches from that time in the wilderness. And all of these things began to help the Israelites answer the questions, 2 big questions. Who is God and who are we? Who is God and who are we? In other words, why had God chosen this ragtag band of Egyptian slaves, and what had he chosen them for? These were not easy questions to answer. For hundreds of years, the Israelites had known only one identity, one purpose. They made bricks for Pharaoh. That was their purpose. Life in Egypt was all that they knew for hundreds of years. Unending manual labor, local gods demanding these terrible sacrifices, and abuse from all of those who thought that the Israelites were weak. In short, all they knew was chaos. And now, as they're journeying through the wilderness in this unfamiliar world, all of a sudden they begin to encounter these other people groups, these other tribes, which frankly weren't all that different from the Egyptians. The Canaanites and the Midianites and the Edomites, all the ites. It was a land of blood and violence and oppression everywhere they looked. But in the midst of that, Yahweh, God, he made it clear that the Israelites were meant to be different. They were special somehow. He reminded Moses and the elders as they were working on this Torah, he reminded them that they were a chosen people. Out of all the nations and the people groups in the world, he had picked them specifically. They had a purpose bigger than their own survival, in other words. And they held on to this purpose as they told and retold the stories of their ancestors, the things that became the book of Genesis. Listen to what God said, by the way. Listen to what God said to Abraham, the father of the Israelites. This was pretty much the core of what it meant for the Israelites to be the chosen people. This comes from Genesis 12. God says to Abraham, I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. You see, God was on a rescue mission to restore the earth back to his intended design, peace and provision and joy and harmony and life in a world renewed. That was his mission. And his plan to accomplish this was to raise up what the Bible calls a holy people, a nation that is set apart from the horrors of the world. A nation set apart so that it could bring blessing and peace to the entire world. That's what Abraham's descendants were called to be. But how are they going to do that? How were the Israelites going to become different? How would they become set apart? What would it take for that nation to become a blessing to all the families on the earth? Well, that is where the law of Moses comes in. Over these many years wandering in the wilderness, God continued to give Moses a set of laws which would govern the Israelites in a whole new way. These laws, if you look in the Bible, they're scattered all throughout Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And all of them put together is what we call the law of Moses. There's a little debate about this, but essentially there are 613 different commands, all of them designed to set Israel, to set Israel apart. 613 commands to set Israel apart. Now, some of them are about religious purity. Others are about how to worship God. So there's plenty of stuff in there about that. But many of them are about a kind of justice that the world had never seen before. For example, in a world where women were often considered property, in Israel, they were supposed to be given dignity and worth and rights. In a world where refugees were often enslaved or left to starve in the streets, in Israel, they would be sheltered and fed. In a world where nonstop work and labor and oppression seemed like the only way to make ends meet, the Israelites were to spend an entire day each week doing no work at all. They called this the Sabbath. This is pretty crazy. In a dog-eat-dog, power-hungry world, the Israelites were to never rely on military might, never to rely on their own strength, but instead only on the protection of God. They weren't even allowed to build idols. This may not seem like that big of a deal to us, but in the ancient world, idols were how you worshiped. Like you built an idol to your God and you prayed to it. The Israelites weren't even allowed to do that because God wanted nothing to do with the bloodthirsty ways of all the other local religions. Pay attention to this. The law of Moses was not a list of arbitrary rules to follow. It was a vision of a brand new society, a nation of justice and peace and mercy. That's what the law was. And all throughout the law, God made it really clear to the Israelites. Whenever the people would align themselves with this new way to live, they would experience peace and provision and rest. That was God's promise. But whenever they tried to mimic the violence or the oppression of all the other nations around them, things would fall apart. Things would fall apart and they'd start to experience some of that chaos that they experienced in Egypt. It would start to creep into their society. Ultimately, God wanted to restore the world. That was his mission. He wanted to bless all the families on earth. But to do that, he needed a chosen people who obeyed him, a people who were set apart from every other nation. And the law of Moses showed the people of God how to make that happen. You with me so far? So that's what the law of Moses is. The next big question that we probably should ask at this point is, so what? So what? Does this have any relevance for us today? I mean, this law was obviously written for the ancient Israelites living in an ancient world. So does it still matter? Does it still matter? Is it better just to kind of skip right on by? Or should we actually spend time studying it? Well, I'm going to argue, and I'm arguing right now, that the law of Moses is actually very important for us to continue reading and studying and understanding. I think it's crucial for two big reasons. Number one, it's important to see how the law fits in with the bigger storyline of the Bible. We can't miss this. We have to understand this. If you read Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, for example, if you read through that, what you'll see is that it's not all just lists of laws. In fact, each time you get a grouping of laws, it's followed by a narrative section. And what usually happens in those narrative sections is that the Israelites break one or two or a bunch of the laws that they were just given the chapter before. Like, for example, in the Ten Commandments, God tells them, don't make any idols. Don't make any idols, don't worship any idols. And what do 3 chapters later? They make an idol, they build a golden calf, and they worship it. Like, you guys, you just got the law, and then they make that mistake. And that happens again and again in the Torah. But then what you realize is it becomes a pattern which starts to kind of work its way out through the rest of the Old Testament. It happens in the historical books, it happens in the prophets. What you realize in the Old Testament law, and as it's interspersed with these narratives, is that this is a pattern we're meant to pay attention to. It shows us this theme that the people of God struggled. They struggled to keep the law. This theme helps us to understand a bigger idea that something else, something beyond the law was going to be necessary to allow the Israelites to fulfill God's dream for the world. Something else was going to have to happen. Something or someone like Jesus. So that's the first reason to read the law. Because when you see God's heart for Israelite society, and then you see the Israelites constantly rebelling and breaking that law, it's part of a bigger story that leads to Jesus. So when we read the law, it leads to Jesus ultimately, and that's why we should read it. But that's only the first reason. The second reason to study the law is because even though it may seem really irrelevant or weird or completely like pointless in our modern age, the law gives us a glimpse into God's heart for justice. Gives us a glimpse into God's heart for justice. So let me explain what I mean. One of the things that's pretty common in ancient law codes, like ones that you might find in, well, maybe not you unless you're an archaeologist, but that one might find in ancient Egypt or ancient Mesopotamia, is that they all kind of follow a similar pattern. And this includes the Old Testament law, the law of Moses. And that pattern is that these laws do not describe every aspect of life. They are not meant to be comprehensive. For example, when you look at the Old Testament, what you see are only selections of what life is like for ancient Israelites. And what they do, instead of trying to cover every possible circumstance, is they paint a picture of what justice looks like. What justice looks like. So they'll describe one specific situation, and then that way future judges and future kings can look at that and say, oh, I know what justice looked like in that situation. I can apply it to the situation in my life or in front of me. This is what all those ox laws are about, okay? I mentioned those ox laws earlier, right? There are so many laws about oxen in the Old Testament. I had to ask last service if anybody knew the etymology of the word oxen, because I kept getting oxen and ox and oxes confused. So someone told me it's from Old English. It doesn't matter. Anyway, so these laws, all these laws about oxen and oxes goring people and all that stuff, they are not in our Bibles because the ancient Israelites needed comprehensive ox laws to function as a society. That's not why they're there. Yes, I realize that oxen were a very important part of an agricultural society, but they're not there to try to be comprehensive. No, they're there to show future rulers, future judges what justice looks like. For example, let's say like 100 years after the law is written, somebody's out in their neighbor's field walking to whatever, and they get kicked in the face by a donkey. First of all, don't walk behind donkeys. That's like your first mistake. But if they get kicked in the face by a donkey, they lose a bunch of teeth, they're really upset, and they go to their local judge and they say, "Judge, I want justice. I got kicked in the face by a donkey." Well, that judge, he's not going to be like, "Look, dude, I wish I could help you. There's nothing in the law about donkey kicking, so I can't help you at all." No, what he'll do is he'll look in the law for what does it say about when an ox gores somebody or something along those lines, and he'll say, that's what justice looks like to our God. I think I know what justice might look like in this circumstance. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? The law represents justice. It paints a picture of justice. That's why it's possible, by the way, to do what the psalmist says in Psalm 1, to delight in the law of the Lord, meditating on it day and night. I used to always look at that and think, what a weird thing to do. Why would you meditate on a bunch of regulations? But when you realize that the law of God, the law of Moses, is actually just a window into the justice of God, then you can start to understand how you might actually meditate on it and begin to let it transform you. It could actually lead to you living quite a different life in the ancient world. So, when you read the law of Moses, I want you to remember these two things. Number one, it's a part of a bigger story that leads to Jesus. And number two, it shows us what God's justice looked like for the ancient Israelites. Now, all that said, even with those two things in mind, I guarantee there are going to be parts of the law that will bore you and probably lose you. It is really hard to find relevancy to our lives when you read like an extensive list of how you're supposed to build the tabernacle and how many like inches wide the lampstands need to be and all that stuff. Like that kind of stuff, probably not going to mean a whole lot to us today. However, there are parts of the law that can honestly change your life if you let it. If you let it. So I'm not saying that the law of Moses should be a page turner, but there is stuff in there that's worth reading. And also, I want to clear something else up, just in case this is still confusing to you. This law, the law of Moses, we are not bound to follow these laws today. Now, I realize this might be confusing for some of you, but when Jesus came and lived his life on the earth, he fulfilled the law of Moses. And by his death and his resurrection, he took away our need to follow that law to be made right with God. So thanks to Jesus, we don't have to follow these laws to the letter. I wanted to make sure that's clear. So I guess the question is then, if these laws were for the ancient Israelites, and if we don't have to follow them because of Jesus, then do they still have any relevancy today? Do they still mean anything to us? Well, this is when we start looking at the worlds of the text, and hopefully start to find something in the world in front of the text. So here's what we're gonna do. Like I said, I really think that there's stuff in here that can change your life. Let me prove it to you. Let's look at a specific passage of scripture, a specific passage from the law, and see if there's anything that we can glean for our own day-to-day existence. Does that sound like a plan? So let's try this. We're gonna look at Exodus 23, starting at verse 8, which is page 66 in the House Bibles. If you want to use one of the House Bibles, that's great. If you want to use your own Bible, even better. If you're using our app, or if you're watching online and you want to look at the app, you can see I put way too many fun facts about oxen in the app this week. So there's a ton in there. And so yeah, by the way, if you are watching online, hello, nice to see you. And Comunidad Latin, bienvenidos. I have to say that because we love having you here. Okay, so Exodus 23, here's what I'm gonna do. I want to read kind of a few verses here just to give you a taste of what some of this law looks like. And then we're gonna narrow in and look specifically at one law in this group, okay? Let's do that. So Exodus 23, verse 8. The law says this: take no bribes, for a bribe makes you ignore something that you clearly see. A bribe makes even a righteous person twist the truth. You must not oppress foreigners. You know what it's like to be a foreigner, for you yourselves were once foreigners in the land of Egypt. Plant and harvest your crops for 6 years, but let the land be renewed and lie uncultivated during the 7th year. Then let the poor among you harvest whatever grows on its own. Leave the rest for wild animals to eat. The same applies to your vineyards and olive groves. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but on the 7th day you must stop working. This gives your ox and your donkey a chance to rest. Another ox law, by the way. It also allows your slaves and the foreigners living among you to be refreshed. Pay close attention to all my instructions. You must not call on the name of any other gods. Do not even speak their names. Okay, so I wish we had the time to dig into all these laws in this section. Frankly, the whole chapter 23 would be really interesting to look at, but we don't. So what I want to do is I just want to look specifically at verses 10 and 11. Verses 10 and 11. Take a look at those. Look back at those. Plant and harvest for 6 years, and let the land be renewed on the 7th. Now, in the Bible, this law, this idea is called the Sabbath year. Sabbath. Remember in the idea of the Sabbath, actually it's talked about in verse 12. The Sabbath is every 7 days you're not supposed to work. The Israelites were not supposed to work. They were supposed to take the whole day off and just rest and pray and be in God's presence and be in the presence of community. That was the Sabbath day. Well, this law is introducing the Israelites to the Sabbath year, where they spend the entire year not working, not harvesting. It's pretty crazy. So this is called the Sabbath year. And why don't we start with this? This whole series we've been talking about these 3 worlds of the text, right? The worlds behind the text, the world of the text, and the world in front of the text. So let's start with the world behind the text. What would this law have meant to someone living in ancient Israel, let's say? Well, if you were to start by looking at a commentary or maybe a Bible dictionary or something, what you'd probably find, if you looked at this passage, is that the idea of crop rotation and agriculture, and I promise this won't be long because if this bores you, it was starting to become a pretty common, understandable thing in the ancient world. Now, they didn't understand the science behind it. They didn't understand nitrates and phosphorus. They didn't understand all that stuff. But what they did know is that if you planted some crops in the ground and you did it the same crop year after year after year, eventually you would deplete the soil and it wouldn't be able to grow crops anymore. So they understood, well before the time that this was written, they understood that you have to let crops rotate around which soil is being used for which crops. And you have to give opportunity for the land to rest. So this idea, this was prudent to let land rest. But what's provocative about this law is the idea that it's not just saying, make sure you rotate your crops. It's saying, let your entire land rest for an entire year. For an entire year, think about that. No harvesting, no planting, no crops whatsoever for an entire year. Remember, this is back before bank accounts, okay? Your crops were your wealth. This was how you survived. Letting the land lie fallow like this, that's what it's called when you don't do anything to it, letting it lie fallow. This would have required an incredible amount of trust that God was going to provide for you, wouldn't it? But get this, it gets even crazier, because when you start to look at the world of the text, remember how this text connects to other ones around it? When you look at the world of the text, what you see is that this is only one of a whole set of laws having to do with this idea of the Sabbath year. It shows up in other places in the law. So like in Deuteronomy 15, it talks again about this Sabbath year, but then it goes one step further, and it also says that every Sabbath year, every seventh year, you're also supposed to forgive all debts. So imagine being an ancient Israelite, and you're being asked to not only do no work on your land on the seventh year, but also if anyone owes you money at that seventh year, debt's forgiven, it's fine, you're good to go. That's kind of crazy. But it gets even crazier, because in Leviticus 25, it adds to this whole idea of the Sabbath year. And it says every seventh Sabbath year, in other words, every 49th or possibly 50th year, scholars debate which one it was, then you are also supposed to release all slaves and allow all of your land to go back to its original owners. That's nuts. That's nuts. That, by the way, was called the year of Jubilee. Every 49th or 50th year, the year of Jubilee. So essentially, when you put together all of these laws about the land, you look at the whole law and you see how these all connect, you get the picture that God wanted the Israelites to live very, very differently from the rest of the world. They were expected to share what they had with others, okay, even people who are outside of their tribe. They were expected to live in harmony with their land and with their animals and with each other. And they were expected, get this, they were expected to build their wealth with great restraint. To build their wealth with great restraint. Think about it. In the ancient world, when survival was very, very hard, it would have been so tempting to squeeze every last ounce of product from your land, from every square inch of your land, to push and push until you got all of the crops you could get from the land, even if it depleted the soil. It would have been tempting to sweep in and take poor refugees and make them work for you, make them your slaves, or to force your oxen to work 24/7 without a break. Like, those are the ways that you got rich in the ancient world, but that's not what God had in mind. God's vision for Israel was one, in Hebrew, of shalom and Sabbath. Shalom and Sabbath, peace and rest. The Sabbath year was just one of the ways that God was teaching the people of Israel to say this: look, what I have is enough. What I have is enough, and I trust that God will provide everything else I need. Now, God knew that this wasn't going to be easy. So listen to what he tells the Israelites in Leviticus 25 about the Sabbath year. He says, but you might ask, well, what will we eat during the seventh year, since we're not allowed to plant or harvest crops that year? Be assured that I will send my blessing for you in the sixth year, so the land will produce a crop large enough for 3 years. Wow, that's quite a promise. That is quite a promise. So how did the Israelites do with this whole idea? How did they hold up? Did they love this? They just had a blast with this whole Sabbath year thing? Yeah, no, not so much. Not so much. When you look at the Old Testament and you look for where this was lived out, you basically find that it wasn't. I mean, there are maybe some hints of references, but from what we can tell, the Israelites never actually practiced the Sabbath year. Definitely not the year of Jubilee. At least not in the entire nation. This was not something that they wanted to do. The fact is, trusting God like this, for them, from their perspective, it was just too risky. It was just too risky. The same thing was true for the people of God for the next several hundred years, for the next 1,000 years. It took the coming of Jesus, hundreds of years after this law was written, to show the people of God that a lifestyle of radical, complete trust in God was actually possible. That's what it took. So, the Sabbath year was a really important part of the law of Moses, but when we look at the whole Bible, we realize that it was not easy to follow. It was not easy to follow. So those are some of the things that we can gather from the worlds behind and of the text. And hopefully by now you're starting to see that this law is not just some random regulation about crops. It's actually a part of a whole way of living that God had intended for his people. A way of peace, a way of rest, a way of enough. A way of enough. And by the way, can you imagine if they had truly lived like this and God had truly provided for them, how unique they would have been in the ancient world? How much of a light they would have been? They would have been a blessing. All right, so what about the world in front of the text? What about your world? What about my world? What does this law have to do with us? I mean, most of us don't have crops. I grow basil on my back porch, but that doesn't really count, I don't think. Most of us don't have vineyards or olive groves. And like I said before, because of Jesus, we're not bound to follow this law to be right with God. So does this ancient regulation have anything to do with our lives today? Well, let me ask you this. God's vision for Israel was one of shalom and Sabbath, right? Peace and rest. Do you think he still wants that for you? You think he still wants you to experience peace and rest? Do you think he wants you to have a lifestyle of enough? Does that sound like your life? I mean, does that describe how you live? When you think about your paycheck or your investments or your allowance money, when you think about all the things you own or all the things you do, how much margin do you leave? How much breathing room do you have? Do you push and squeeze and make every last inch of your land, so to speak, productive? Is every last penny in your bank account spoken for? Or do you live with open hands? Do you freely share what you have with others and trust that God is going to provide? Look, just like the Israelites, those of us who follow Christ, we are still called to be a nation set apart, to be a holy nation, a people set apart from the world. We are still called to show the world a whole new way to live, trusting God to provide, in harmony with our world. Is that how you live? All throughout this series, we've steered clear of giving you guys final big idea conclusions about the passages that we've looked at. Instead, we've tried to let you reach your own conclusions about what God is saying to you in this passage. And I want to do the same thing right now. I want to give you an opportunity to hear the voice of the Holy Spirit and perhaps find something that God wants you to know about this passage right now. So do me a favor, if you don't mind, close your eyes for a moment. Close your eyes for a moment and think about your life. Think about the things you have and the money that you receive and the work that you do. Think about all of that. And let me ask you some questions to let the Holy Spirit speak. What would it mean for you to let the land of your life rest? What would it mean for you to stop trying so hard and let God provide for you? In what part of your life is the Holy Spirit asking you to say enough? Friends, the invitation is there for us to awaken to a whole new way to live. How will you respond?